So our final speaker on this session will be Aparna Venktesan, and she will be speaking on the subject of space as shared environment and intangible cultural heritage. Aparna will be speaking online, and go ahead and share your screen, Aparna.
She's muted.
You're muted, Aparna. You need to unmute.
Sorry about that. I was unmuted. It seemed to have done it again. All right. So starting over, I'm delighted to be with you all today. And I want to begin on a note of gratitude and acknowledgement. I respectfully acknowledge those whose ancestral homelands I live and work on, the Ramaytush Ohlone of San Francisco and the Coast Miwok. I honor all ancestors, past and present, and the traditional custodians of the land, water, and skies where each of you are. I also want to thank the conference organizers for the space and time to talk here today, with a special shout out to Jessica, John, Connie. I know how hard you've worked and how deeply you care. I also want to honor all my SatCon 2 and Compass colleagues in the audience. Our shared work is more precious to me than I can easily share. And last, I thank my children and my students who keep me accountable to the future every day. We are living in very exciting times. We are moving out into space, and because we originated in stars and supernovae, I think it's fair to say we are returning to space. So as this narrative unfolds and our views of ourselves change as we explore first LEO, the moon, and beyond, our science will change, our storytelling will change, and our views and sense of relation to place will change as well. So we're on the cusp of a new exciting era. But this is not an era that is limited to the present. We have always been explorers in all traditions. And I show here what looks like a launch of a Falcon Heavy. And some of you might think, oh, that's a really pretty view of San Francisco Bay. But I want to draw your attention to this small craft, which is the Hokulea, returning to San Francisco after almost 30 years last weekend. So I'm going to zoom in here, and I'll say a little bit more about it later in my talk, just to give you a sense relative to the Golden Gate Bridge, how very small it is, yet how large the courage, as well as the scale of the ancestral knowledge that showed them how to sail across thousands of miles of open ocean with non-instrument traditional wayfinding techniques using just the stars. Soon after this picture, they were met by a circle of canoes and they were escorted onto land where local Ohlone, Miwok, and Pomo leadership were waiting. And the voyagers asked for permission to enter the land, something that's already been mentioned by Hilding and other speakers, followed by hours of ceremony. So I say this because this age of exciting exploration is not limited to the present. We have always been, as a species, curious and exploratory. But we are living through times where we are increasingly disconnected from our millennia-old relationship with the night sky. As a cosmologist, I love studying ancient objects, but I think it's worth honoring here our ancient relationship with the night sky, something that is at increasing risk. And I want to advocate in this talk for dark skies as a human right and as a timeless relationship that we need to start reclaiming without being in conflict with our other aspects of curiosity and exploration. And I share here an image from the Dark Sky Associates, Dark Sky International, and also that moment in 2019 when the first satellite trains began to go across. And now, of course, they're far more common. But I share this because ground and space-based light pollution is increasing by leaps and bounds. And it's not just brightening our skies, but to many cultural practitioners, indigenous communities, this represents colonization happening all over again, just this time expanded to a cosmic scale, erasing indigenous stories and identities again. This is also happening at a time when much of what we know and is familiar is being erased. And I want to remind you of just a little over a year ago at COP26, when Tuvalu's foreign minister made a call that we are sinking and we need help. So how do we cope with this time when there's so much crisis and much of what we knew as familiar is going away? And in fact, I would say that given how quickly we are feeling the impacts of climate change and other changes in our world, our traditional ways of tracking, calendaring, and storytelling and marking time are passing quickly, whether it's the arrival of the fish at a certain time of year, wind and ocean currents, cycles of pollinators, these are going away. And so the skies remain as a last stand of calendaring and traditions for us. So very much worth defending, as is our planet. You will hear talks all week on satellite constellations and all the wonderful things they will bring, as well as the potential peril ahead. So let me just emphasize a couple of key points. We know that we are on the cusp of an era that is rapidly changing the environment of sky. And while we astronomers do not want to come across as the Grinches of economic development or bringing affordable broadband to all, we are very concerned about the potential short and long-term costs of the way things are happening and how quickly. And as you'll hear over this week, there are coordinated ground-based campaigns to assess the impacts of the growing number of satellite streaks in astronomical images. But I also want to draw your attention to the aggregate effect. At some point, there'll be enough satellites, each with different design specifications, surface areas, and presenting differently, that we really need to account for a potentially large rise in global sky brightness, which is especially alarming because we can't get away from it anywhere on the planet. Keep in mind, this is in addition to recent documented citizen-based science revealing dramatic year-over-year rises in ground-based light pollution. So 2023 has been a very consequential year for increasing number of satellites in LEO, low Earth orbits, and now is the time to be thinking about this. In fact, some would say a few years ago. We've heard and we will continue to hear about some of the strong concerns and consequences of the enormous proliferation of satellites, which includes debris proliferation and debris generating events. I want to point out that many have already begun to assume that, well, we'll just do all of astronomy from space. But that is simply not practical. We need to keep up the momentum for ground-based discoveries and treat in the most perhaps economical way or viewpoint everything that we have invested in ground-based facilities as ground-based assets and protecting those and to prevent loss of astronomical data and diminished opportunities for future astronomers from ground-based observing. It's simply not practical to put all telescopes at L2 like James Webb. And even given where we're at right now, there is a dollar cost already for the loss of data for ground-based telescopes, because as the skies brighten, we need longer integration time per object, and that leads to a loss not just of one scientific program, but the number of scientific programs that we can have per year at a scientific facility on the ground, because if everything needs longer integration times, well, we can't have as many scientific programs. So we've calculated this in a paper with John Barentine, Jessica Heim, James Lowenthal, and collaborators. So this will quickly become expensive, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that brighter skies don't just impact astronomers, they impact constituencies well beyond professional astronomers. Now, I've put a list here, and I'll focus on a couple of them for the remainder of my talk. So it's not just our science that's impacted. In fact, this impacts the science of other communities other than just modern astronomers. There have been astronomers across all traditions and all cultures, and I focus here for a moment on wayfinding with deep gratitude to the Circle of Oceania Wayfinders, the Ohana Wa, who invited me into dialogue a few years ago. And some of you may know this already, but for those of you who don't, I want to draw your attention to the fact that given just how satellites work, they are quite visible in the ground, low in the sky, at dawn or dusk, soon after launch. Later, of course, they'll be up all night at higher altitudes. But for real-time observations, such as wayfinding that use horizon markers, we cannot back correct like we do with streaks with filters or software or other back corrections. So this is real-time interference at just the times of day, dawn or dusk, and just the elevations that will interfere with a millennia-old scientific tradition. And that's just the individual satellites. With the predicted rise of global sky brightness, this is going to impact all constellations for wayfinders, as well as numerous other indigenous sky traditions, which you have heard about today from our amazing indigenous speakers earlier in today's program. So as we move forward into this era and coping with the loss of sky as environment, I want to quote the wonderful voyagers from the most recent journey of the Hokulea, called the Moana Nui Akea. It's an incredibly impressive journey, by the way, 43,000 nautical miles in a 4-year journey, docking at 345 ports, sailing for the health of our oceans and our planet. And I quote this because I think it has relevance for us as we voyage into space. We are now guided by what the World Voyage has told us. And by the way, they just began this June and they just passed through San Francisco. We must deepen our values in the voyage and move from exploration and understanding to malama, or caring, and kuleana, or taking responsibility. With those values, we must move discovery towards choices and actions that we believe will help build a future good enough for our children. This is our most difficult voyage yet, because the destination is not ours. It will be the most difficult island yet to find, because it is the future of island Earth. And I want to share with you as well a little quote building on that to offer a bit of hope. We are just at the beginning of this. I know there's many crises that seem intractable, but in the case of space and our growing presence in space, it is not inevitable yet how the story will unfold. And I quote the New York Times author Ezra Klein. This was in the context of AI, but very relevant for what we do. To suggest we go slower or even stop entirely has come to seem childish. If one company slows down, another will speed up. If one country hits pause, the others will push harder. Fatalism becomes the handmaiden of inevitability, and inevitability becomes the justification for acceleration. End quote. But I say to you, we still have time. Things seem inexorable right now, but they are not inevitable. And I put here, and I'll let you read, the broader view of how the skies and space belong to all of us, and not just people, but all life. And we need to honor that through advocacy and partnering together in this shared journey. I want to draw attention briefly, just because we are living through such elegiac times with a lot of loss and mourning. Something I wrote recently with John Barentine, we coined a term, noctalgia, to express sky grief. We were inspired by the term solastalgia, which is mourning for the loss of home environment. And we coined the term noctalgia to express sky grief for the accelerating loss of the home environment of our shared skies, which represents not just loss of science, astronomical observing, but heritage, millennia-old sky tradition, place-based language, and more. Many of you with whom it was such a privilege to work with in SATCON 2 and beyond have advocated for declaring space as an environment and considering the environmental impacts of all phases of satellites. Just like with electric vehicles, we want to keep track of the narrative arc of what it takes to make an EV car's battery, starting with the mining that needs to happen for the rare elements that go into those batteries. We want to consider the narrative arc of satellite launches, operation, and deorbiting. So we need ways to assess all that in a meaningful way and have that be a part of how we allow licensing as well as space traffic management. We've had a little bit of a preview of this already. Many of you knew about the cratering of the launch site, as well as the enormous cloud of debris and dust that settled over fragile ocean habitat, as well as a fragile wildlife refuge right by the Starship launch pad in Boca Chica, already generating environmental lawsuits. So this is, again, something we need to get out ahead of through environmental advocacy and more, and protection. And in the last few minutes of my talk, I want to call on all of us to learn from history, all the other disruptor industry moments that was poised to change a landscape for generations. And I mean disruptor in good and perhaps challenging ways as well. Sometimes new technologies, new developments, new discoveries bring needed change and connect people more than ever. But it's how it unfolds and how it has unfolded historically that we need to learn from, and what regulations for those industries did or did not accomplish. So I want to call on us to reimagine heritage, not just as isolated locations or structures or landing sites, but the very environment from which all human ways of knowing arise. Because what is a community if we take away the place, the environment that leads to their origin story, their language, their identity, their storytelling, their science? So let's grow our ideas of heritage to include the environment from which all human ways of knowing can be protected and honored. We know that what we're doing in LEO will be inexorably carried forward in what we do on the moon and beyond. And as Hilding and others have eloquently advocated for today, the moon and space objects have value and cultural significance beyond our mere utilitarian purposes for them. I know there's a $2 trillion space economy that's out there and increasingly on everyone's minds. And I realize and own the irony of the rare elements in my laptop and my phone that I'm relying on to give this talk, and which will eventually need mining in space. I just think we can go about this more intentionally and not treat these environments as inanimate and simply awaiting extraction by us. So I want to end where I began, which is with ancestors and the redwoods. So space is our shared ancestor, whether as astronomers we know that we are from the stars, or whether we view our origin story as being in the skies and from space. And I want to build on this by just showing you something from my backyard, where the UN was founded in San Francisco almost 80 years ago. Here's a beautiful plaque on a trail I often like to do in Muir Woods, starting with "Here in this grove of enduring redwoods preserved for posterity." And I want to draw an analogy to the redwoods being like the skies, our shared skies. They are the canopy of the stars, and we, human beings and life, are like the forest understory that relies on that canopy, and in turn, that canopy relies on us. So in this relational approach, I want to call, as the understory, on the United Nations to declare space as intangible cultural heritage in need of urgent safeguarding and part of nature's environments with its own rights, needing conservation and wise stewardship in a relational, ethical way. And I will end this talk by thanking you again for your time and calling on all of us to be the scientific and otherwise life elders that the future deserves. And as we call on this viewpoint and to honor space, not just as our ancestor, but as intangible cultural heritage, I lay out some arguments that John Barentine and I are developing to actually help us move this towards a declaration and eventually law. We have existing UN declarations and treaties with signatories, ratification only for a handful of these, including the High Seas Treaty and the OST. And I want to especially mention the High Seas Treaty because that just had a wave of signatories just a little over a week ago in the United Nations, which was so deeply inspiring. And honoring what is in the High Seas Treaty, including the conservation of biodiversity in marine environments, that's something to keep in mind, as well as all of these, as we look at all phases of satellite operation, including decommissioning into the atmosphere and oceans. So I will end here and thank everyone for your time.